Healthcare should be free of racism. Yet Indigenous peoples in Canada continue to experience health disparities due to the legacy of colonization and ongoing racism. They are more likely than other Canadians to experience persistent poverty, food insecurity, and barriers to housing and education, key contributors to chronic illnesses and other health challenges. We must do better, which involves Indigenous peoples leading the way forward. In June, Dr. Alika Lafontaine, the CMA's first Indigenous president, announced our commitment to making a formal apology for the harms caused to Indigenous peoples. He made the announcement as part of our series of online fireside chats. Here's a video clip of that historic announcement.
The CMA, there's been a lot of work to build on the path to reconciliation. And it's obviously hundreds and hundreds of steps. It requires space to be created. And I think today we're taking an important step that acknowledges that trust and relationships are at the core of reconciliation. You know, that is why truth leads to reconciliation. And with that in mind, I will acknowledge tonight that the CMA is going to take a vital step in our reconciliation journey towards a formal apology to Indigenous people, rooted in an accurate shared history about what happened and what matters most to Indigenous people. The path to an apology will be informed by an honest examination of our 150 plus year history here at the CMA. And I expect it's going to take us to many uncomfortable and painful conversations. But the hope is that through this process, the CMA can be a part of reconciling and transforming the relationship that the medical profession has with Indigenous peoples and actually bring us closer to true reconciliation.
As Dr. Lafontaine mentioned, reconciliation involves many steps, and this next session is about taking an important one. We're very fortunate to hear from members of the BC Office of the Provincial Health Officer, who will share the actions and journey they have taken towards reconciliation. We will learn about the ways that white supremacy or white privilege is expressed in our systems, values, ideologies, and how it forms the bedrock of Canada. We will also learn that being Indigenous is not the risk factor for morbidity and early mortality, but the result of being subjugated to colonial practices and policies. Most importantly, we will learn that when we approach this work, we need to be grounded in love and care. Now, some of you may find this session triggers unexpected emotions. And if you're feeling overwhelmed at any point, the CMA has reserved an Indigenous safe space in room 101. We also have a wellness room available to all participants in room 2D on the second level. Dr. Bonnie Henry was appointed British Columbia's Provincial Health Officer in 2018 and is responsible for undertaking measures for disease prevention and control and the health protection of all British Columbians. Most recently, she led the province's response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the drug overdose emergency. She has served in several senior roles at the BC Centre for Disease Control and Toronto Public Health, including as the operational lead in the response to the SARS outbreak in Toronto. She has worked internationally with the World Health Organization, UNICEF polio eradication program in Pakistan, and with the WHO to control the Ebola outbreak in Uganda. Please give a warm welcome to Bonnie Henry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning. It's always nerve-wracking to speak in public, even after all this time, but I'm very grateful to be here. And following the session that we had, and I know we talked about how talking about private healthcare makes us uncomfortable, I think this session might make you a little uncomfortable as well. I know it does me. But I do say it warms my public health heart to hear an emergency physician talk about social determinants of health. So I think we've come a long way. To get started, I do want to also acknowledge and recognize that our thoughts are with our colleagues and friends in the Northwest Territories and in the interior of British Columbia this morning, this afternoon, as the wildfires are approaching some of the largest cities in our communities, and our hearts go out to them. So we will start by our conflict of interest disclosures and get those out of the way to start with. This is mine. I am, as in my role as Provincial Health Officer, I provide advice to government on a variety of health issues. Occasionally they take that advice. That's part of my disclosures. And I'm really grateful to be here with two of my esteemed colleagues and good friends, Dr. Danièle Behn and her conflict of interest will come up here. And Dr. Kate Jongbloed, whose conflict of interest slide will come up next. And Kate? Oh, it's not yet. Okay. There, now you're good.
I wanted to just say, as I shared my disclosure here, I'm a white lady, an occupier on the territory of the Musqueam people, and I'm very lucky to work as a postdoc fellow in the Office of the Provincial Health Officer with Bonnie and Danièle.
Thank you. So this is the title of our slide, and we very specifically use some words that are often words that we don't hear very often, particularly as white people in this world. And it's about unlearning and undoing the systemic white supremacy in our systems and racism within our office. And this is a journey. We are not yet at the end of that journey or even close. It's a journey that we've started. And we want to share some of the work that we've been doing with you today. I do want to start as well by acknowledging that I am a settler in this world, and I grew up as a fifth generation now settler in Mi'kmaq territory on the far east coast of Canada. In the West, we have to call it the Far East because they think anything west of Alberta is east, right? And I do want to put this up because the work, and acknowledge the work the Canadian Medical Association has been doing. And they have acknowledged the lands that we are privileged to be on here today, the traditional territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples, and we're very grateful to be able to meet and on these lands today. So one of the things since 2021 that our office has been disciplined about doing is making concerted efforts to unlearn and undo the ways in which white supremacy and racism show up in our policies, our practices, our approaches, and the system that we work within. One of the changes we have made is to always acknowledge the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples at the beginning of all of our documents, our presentations, our reports. And that's why I will begin today by acknowledging that I live and work and very occasionally these days get to play on the traditional unceded territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations in what we call Victoria. But I also want to recognize that First Nation territories stretch to every inch of the province of British Columbia and this country, that inherent rights that are rooted in the connection to the lands and waters have never been ceded or surrendered. And we know that these inherent rights are upheld in international, in Canada, in national, and in BC, in provincial laws that we need to pay attention to. We also acknowledge that there are generations of Indigenous rights holders who are First Nations, Métis, and Inuit from elsewhere in Canada who call British Columbia home now. So I'm just going to take a brief introduction and then turn over to my colleagues. This was work that we had been doing in small bits and for several years. We had a number of things in BC. My predecessor had started work on an Indigenous health reporting so that we could daylight the issues that we were seeing in health inequities. We have the wonderful First Nations Health Authority, and my colleagues, Shannon McDonald and Danièle, who you heard yesterday, are here in the room. We have a Deputy Provincial Health Officer for Indigenous Health and Wellness. It was originally Dr. Evan Adams, and now I'm privileged to work with Dr. Danièle Behn-Smith. And we have a number of different training programs in British Columbia. Some of you may be familiar with the SANYAS training and other things. And we've been doing this in bits and pieces, but the pandemic really made us understand that we needed to do more, and we needed to do it in a more systematic way. The systems that we had, that we were working in, continually choked First Nations leaders' ability to do what they needed to do for their own communities. And we started developing relationships with First Nations, with Métis Nation BC and Métis organizations, and we have a very small group of Inuit peoples in British Columbia as well. One of the things that came up, for example, in the pandemic was the Emergency Programs Act in BC said that if First Nations wanted to do additional measures or measures within their communities to protect their communities during a crisis, that they had to have the PHO give permission for that and say that it was health related. And we said, no, that doesn't make sense. You know, who am I to say that what these leaders know they need in their community is approved or not approved? And it took a long time for our colleagues in emergency management to understand that. They said, well, why just approve everything? And I'm like, no, you don't understand. That system is racist. Why do I need to approve something that these people who are the leaders in their community know they need? So we got that taken out of the Emergency Programs Act. Teeny little step forward, but an important one. So this was one of the things that we realized, that we didn't have the words and the tools to know how to do this work in a good way, in a way that wouldn't cause more harm, and that we needed to change the systems that we work in. But yesterday we heard as well, we needed to change the culture, those unwritten norms as well. And in medicine, we have that. We know that there are ways that we do things, the hierarchies, the protocols that are not necessarily written, but that are deeply ingrained and designed to give unearned advantage to many of us and unearned disadvantage to others. So this learning journey has opened my eyes, and as somebody with a lot of privilege, privilege of being a white settler, it has been hard. It has been hard. Words like white supremacy and racism make me uncomfortable, but I've learned that it's important to say them anyway, and they have a lot of emotional baggage attached to them. But once we see what's happening, once we see those structures that are holding other people out, it's impossible. We cannot and we must not unsee those. And I'm going to turn it over here in a minute to talk a bit more detail, but I want to leave you with a thought about radical empathy. And this is something that hit home to me. It's a quote from an African-American journalist and writer, Isabel Wilkerson, and she was talking about the experience of Black racism in the United States. But she talks about radical empathy means putting in the work to educate oneself and to listen with a humble heart, to understand another's experience from their perspective, not as we imagine we would feel. Radical empathy, and I would say this unlearning and undoing we're doing, is not about you and what you think you would do in a situation you have never been in, perhaps never will be in. It is the kindred connection from a place of deep knowing that opens your spirit to the pain of another as they may perceive it. So I will leave you with that and turn it over to my colleagues, and then at the end we'll come back and talk a little bit more about the exercise we're going to do. Thank you.
Thanks, Bonnie. Yeah. Thanks, you. Yes. Thank you. Can anybody see you? Tanche Kiowau, Doani, Danièle Behn Smith Dishnakashin, Sezitla Danièle Behn Smith, and Michifnia Pi Echodene At Fort Nelson First Nation Pi Winnipeg Doschin, Lekwangin Tanah, Niwikin, Anush, Anishinaabe Algonquin Diane. Good morning, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be with you this morning. I'm Danièle. I am Métis on my mom's side from the Red River Valley. I'm Echodene on my dad's side from Fort Nelson First Nation. I get to live and work with Bonnie on Lekwungen territories, and I'm so grateful to be joining you here today on the territories of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin Nation. I work as BC's Deputy Provincial Health Officer for Indigenous Health, and I'm a cisgendered heterosexual woman who uses she and her pronouns, and I'm trying to say that out loud as many times as I can because that creates heteronormative blind spots for me, and so when I say it out loud, I try to be more mindful. So our project has many guiding principles that ground the work that Bonnie's just been talking about. So we acknowledge that systemic white supremacy is an everyday problem that requires everyday attention to arrest, unlearn, and undo. That's a teaching that's come to us from Joe Gallagher. Truth must always come before reconciliation. We privilege the voices of Indigenous people, Black people, and other people of color. We wrap ourselves, each other, and everyone that's doing this work in love and care. And this has really been such an important principle for us. This quilt that you see on the right-hand side of the screen is a quilt that was given to Kate by her late mom, Jen Gate, and Kate has generously gifted it to us as part of an anchor image for this project. And when we started this work in the fall of 2021, we were depleted. Our team was depleted. We certainly were very depleted, still in the throes of the pandemic. And here we were asking our team to come on this journey with us to do this really hard work. So we grounded ourselves in love and care. And then, as I say, we blanket everybody in the room today as we do this work together. We endeavor to be humble, we have open hearts and open minds, and we have a willingness to own and fix harms that we identify along the way. We err on the side of Indigenous rights. We share the lessons that we're learning, so we're so grateful to the organizers for inviting us to share with you this morning. No one should have to do this work alone, and we endeavor to do our homework, and we're going to talk a lot about what that looks like for us. I'm reflecting on Tim Caulfield's talk yesterday. We were talking about what a just charismatic presenter he is. And then this morning I was like trying to get more movement in, and I was like, no, I can't like get these squats in. So apologies, I'm much more static. We are so grateful to Kukum Shirley and the Canadian Medical Association for translating our guiding principles into Anishinaabemowin. And as part of that humility, I need to acknowledge that I didn't take the time to learn how to pronounce these in Anishinaabe, so that really would have been the most respectful way to observe this protocol, and I didn't do that. So I'm going to name it and acknowledge that, and also just be so grateful that we now have this in our slide deck. So we are just so grateful to these two incredible women, Dr. Kamara Jones, who's an American, or was the past president of the American Public Health Association, and Puglas Jody Wilson-Raybould, because they've offered us frameworks that have assisted us in doing this work. So Dr. Kamara Jones published a Science and Practice of Anti-Racism framework, and that's how we got started. She gives us 3 tasks to undertake: name racism and white supremacy, ask how they're operating in our sphere of influence, and organize and strategize to act. Jody Wilson-Raybould's new book, True Reconciliation, came out through the course of our project, of our work, and she's named 3 core practices in service to true reconciliation: learn, understand, and act. And so we use both of these frameworks. They seem to overlay really seamlessly, and they've been so helpful to us. I'll pass it to Kate.
So we want to start today with this first practice of learn. That's the work to name, thank you, and illuminate Indigenous-specific racism and white supremacy. And this is really central to the guiding principle that Danièle just shared about truth and reconciliation, and that truth comes before reconciliation. And I'm going to make an attempt now to say the words that Kukum Shirley gave to us. Tebwewin, Pijamagad, Chibwamashi, Kwayak Zidawin. Truth comes before reconciliation. And we often have such an urge to skip through this step and right into action or reconciliation, but we do have to pause. So I want to share this net metaphor for settler colonialism that has been so helpful in our work. And this image here is of a huge sculpture that was created by American artist Janet Echelman. It was in Vancouver in Canada Place in 2014. And if you see this net, you'll realize it's enormous, consisting over 860,000 individual knots and weighing 3,500 pounds. And in this metaphor, we imagine that each of the really big main lines that are holding the net up between these buildings in downtown Vancouver are actually the structures of settler colonialism, those really big ones like the Indian Act, the reserve system, the residential school system. But then these knots that these 860,000 knots actually shape settler colonialism in much finer detail. And those are the policies, the practices, the everyday work that shape settler colonialism in much finer detail. And so in this metaphor, First Nations people are caught in this net, strung high above the traditional territories that are the foundations of their laws, their health and wellness systems, their governance systems, as we talked, or Bonnie shared in the inherent rights slide. So me as a white lady and us as settler Canadians are not trapped in this net. We know that we've created a segregated system of laws that apply only to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people here, a segregated race-based system or apartheid. And from our vantage point on the seawall, in the C-suite, in the hotel rooms around, depending on the time of day and where we're looking from, this net can almost be completely invisible to us, like this daytime picture here. There's just a sliver of this net visible to us. But then sometimes, like for example, when the news of a new unveiling of graves on a residential school site hits the news, it is momentarily lit up so vividly. Our attention is on it. We ask, what can we do in this situation? Until the news cycle recedes and it sort of goes down our list of priorities once again. And so our task as settlers in this metaphor is to keep our attention on the net, to learn more about the dynamics of the net, and not put that burden of keeping it visible on our Indigenous colleagues. So this image too is a really important part of the metaphor. It's installation. So you can see here, there's people in their high-vis vests putting up the net. It's not the artists themselves. It's not Sir John A. Macdonald and Duncan Campbell Scott, but just ordinary Canadians just doing their job to put in this net, to maintain this net, to keep it going and keep it healthy. In the frame, there's also two flags. There's the Canadian flag and the Union Jack. And for me, this really represents the ongoing dominion of an occupation of Coast Salish territory that has never been ceded or surrendered. And even if you were there at noon, they blast the first four notes of O Canada on this unceded territory. Again, a reminder of our dominion and our occupation of these territories. And then finally, you'll see below, there's a tourist attraction, Flyover Canada, which makes me think about how this net stretches to every inch of Canada. It's not just in BC, but it's in the jurisdictions where you live and work as well. And so the artist didn't set out with an intention to provide this specific metaphor. We have permission from her to share these images in this way, but she inadvertently offered us a comment on how we go forward from here. The net isn't solid. Despite many, many attempts for us to tighten the weave, Indigenous resistance has been present on these territories since we arrived. And instead, we've created a very precarious system, the colonial system, which creates those harms that Adrian was talking about in his opening remarks. So we know that cutting these major these major lines would cause tremendous harm. And so instead, we have a responsibility to patiently and with guidance from First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, every day do the work of seeking to untie these colonial knots. Each of us likely has one or more colonial knots in our sphere of influence, and so that's persistent, everyday work is really required.
Thanks, Kate. Awesome, thank you. So we've been using this language of white supremacy, but we haven't really offered a definition yet. So we're gonna use Kent Monkman's painting, The Daddies. Kent Monkman is a Cree artist, and we're gonna use this to help make some meaning and share the way that we understand white supremacy. So the story, as I understand it, is that Kent Monkman saw the original version of this painting, which is called The Fathers of Confederation, done by Robert Harris. And when he saw the original painting, he was struck that in the foreground there was an empty footstool. And so he took that as an opportunity to occupy that space with his alter ego, Mischief Eagle Testicle, and to draw attention to the fact that at this very pivotal moment in history, so the Fathers of Confederation was commemorating the Charlottetown Conference, one of 3 conferences that ultimately led to the Confederacy of Canada. So at this pivotal moment, Indigenous peoples were deliberately excluded. And we were excluded because of epistemological differences and the widely held belief at the time that non-Indigenous ways of knowing and being were superior to that of Indigenous peoples, who in fact at the time weren't regarded as peoples at all really, but as savages. And so in 2023, I am heartened and I'm confident that there's nobody in this room, there's nobody joining us online who holds as a personal belief that non-Indigenous peoples are superior to Indigenous peoples. However, this ideology of white supremacy is so firmly embedded in the bedrock of our country, as Adrian said, in our systems, our structures, and our policies, that it continues to manifest as these gross disparities on pretty much every indicator that we choose to count, including the indicator of leadership. So when we look at this whiteness in leadership in Canadian politics, in BC health, we have to find a way to make meaning of this. And there's essentially 2 potential truths. So the first truth would be that there is something intrinsic about predominantly white men that makes them more suited, better capable of leading. But we've just said that in 2023, that's not a belief that we hold. So the second way that we can make meaning of this and understand this is that these deeply embedded ideologies of white supremacy that form the basis of our structures, our systems, our policies, our practices, continue to confer unearned advantage on a very narrow segment of the population and unearned disadvantage on Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. Here are some graphs from the First Nations Population Health and Wellness Agenda out of BC, a collaboration that we have with the First Nations Health Authority that show some other disparities. And again, we have to hold a 2 things is true tension. So the first thing that's true is that today we categorically refuse and refute the idea that non-Indigenous peoples are superior to Indigenous peoples. The second thing that is true is that we have been socialized, we've been educated, and as Ibram X. Kendi points out to us, we've been socialized and educated to see these disparities as normal. So pretty much on any indicator that we choose to count, we all hold a very deep knowing that non-Indigenous peoples do better than Indigenous peoples. And so we can look to the principles of epidemiology to resolve this tension. And epidemiology is essentially the study of disease patterns, of trying to identify and quantify risk. And so if we use a different example, we say things like, the risk of dying of lung cancer is up to 25 times greater among people who smoke versus people who never smoked. And it's so clear to us in that phrasing that the exposure that confers risk is smoking. But that becomes highly problematic when we use that same phrasing to report these findings. So we say things like, status First Nations have shorter life expectancies than other residents in BC. Or Indigenous students are less likely to graduate from high school than non-Indigenous students. So what we've done in using that phrasing is we've conflated risk with Indigenous identity. And it's the exact opposite. Our identities as Dene, Michif, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Tanaha, Tlingit, Nahiwin, Inuk, those are the things that give us strength and resilience. Our languages, our lands, our ceremonies, those are protective factors. Being subjected to Canadian colonial practices and policies is irrefutably bad for a person's health and for our determinants of health. And so we need to state that really clearly. That brings us back to the work that we're doing at the Office of the Provincial Health Officer to eradicate white supremacy and racism and to ground ourselves in the foundational obligations that we hold to uphold the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples. So to be very clear, we don't do this work because we're good people. We don't do it out of benevolence or morality. We do it because we hold legal obligations collectively to uphold the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples. It's in our treaties, it's in the Constitution. It's been upheld in numerous court rulings. It's in federal and provincial UNDRIP law. We have a framework, so the Truth and Reconciliation Commissioners named UNDRIP as the framework for reconciliation. We have hundreds upon hundreds of detailed, specific directions that have been given by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in terms of what we need to do. And so our work is now really firmly oriented in this orange bucket of implementation and doing our homework. And so we've come to a really important insight through the course of this work and in terms of that doing our homework. And that is reflecting on what's the work and whose work is it? What we've noticed in the course of doing this work and in our reflections is that often there's a banner of Indigenous health that gets used. And what we see happen in practice is that all of these issues and all of these work tend to rest on the shoulders of one Indigenous person that's in your organization or a small team that might be the Indigenous health team. What we've found, though, is that there's actually these two separate, distinct, interconnected buckets of work that need to be happening simultaneously in order to advance true reconciliation. So we're using a Dene birch bark basket that comes from Treaty 8 territory from where I'm from to represent our work as First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Our work is to recover from genocide. Our work is to maintain our cultural continuity, to learn our languages, to be out on our lands and waters and carry out our sacred responsibilities to our more than human relatives, to keep our ceremonies going. That is hard, hard work. The work of settlers is represented by this copper pot. This is also hard work. This is the work of seeing, naming, and dismantling and eradicating white supremacy and racism. And we're using a copper pot that comes from Kate's Great Opa's machine shop in Holland, which reminds us that settlers are newcomers to these lands and have different perspectives. I'm so grateful that the last time that I was here on these territories, I got to meet Sarah Williams's auntie, Elder Phyllis Williams from Curve Lake First Nation. And she shared some very important Anishinaabe teachings about copper with me and gave me permission to speak to them in this slide. So when we came up with this realization in BC, we didn't know that copper has a very special place in Anishinaabe culture. And so Elder Phyllis Williams shared with me that copper pots are sacred vessels. They have purifying, healing properties. And when she shared that, I was so moved because it made me think about the possibility and the hope that despite the fact that hurtful and harmful things have happened and continue to happen, this heavy lifting that settlers need to do in this copper pot work can be wrapped in these beautiful teachings, and it can be sacred work that can be healing. So I'm so grateful. Masicho. So I'm going to take a moment and and we can all collectively take a nice big grounding breath. Give thanks for the ancestors for being with us today and guiding us in this work. And we're taking this pause just to wrap everybody again in love and care. These are hard truths, but truth must come before reconciliation. So despite the fact that it's difficult, despite the fact that it's uncomfortable, we need to stand in that discomfort together. No one should do this work alone, and we need to do our homework. So I want to tell you a little bit more concretely, what does that mean for us? How do we do our homework in relation to foundational obligations? So this is where we're so grateful to Puglas Jody Wilson-Raybould, who the creator doesn't make mistakes. And as we were coming, Kate actually physically bumped into her at the airport in Vancouver and was able to offer collective thanks on behalf of our team. So what we do is we're going through and asking ourselves these questions repeatedly. So what homework have I and my team done to learn from the original inhabitants of these lands and waters about their laws and teachings, as well as the truths of settler colonial harms and how they continue to manifest in the present day in this place? What homework have I and my team done to understand what must be done in our sphere of obligations to meet foundational obligations? And how have I and my team begun to act in ways that challenge, elevate, and advance true reconciliation, including hardwiring accountability and marathon actions towards meeting foundational obligations? These words, challenge, elevate, and advance, come from Jody Wilson-Raybould's True Reconciliation book, and they are so helpful in us discerning where our actions lie on a spectrum from performative to really affecting meaningful change. And so Jody asks us to reflect on actions like hanging artwork or erecting a monument. And she invites us to question, are those actions that took real courage? Are those actions that created uncomfortable change? If the answer is no, then you're probably in that sort of performative end of the spectrum, and you need to gradually move yourself into those spaces of uncomfortable change. Yesterday, our colleague Dr. Nell Wyman mentioned this TRC Calls to Action 23 and 24 medical school report card, and we wanted to share a little bit about that with you today because as we were preparing for this morning in BC, we were trying to think of an area where collectively we all have some commonality, where we could be focusing our work and our efforts in copper pot areas together, and we landed on medical education because for the physicians in the room anyway, I'm confident that you've all been through medical education, and most of us continue to have relationships with our local faculties of medicine through preceptorship and things like that. So in 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report was released. It had 2 actions that related specifically to healthcare and medical education. So calling upon all levels of government to increase the number of Aboriginal professions working in the healthcare field, provide cultural competency training for all healthcare professionals. Call to Action 24, we call upon medical and nursing schools in Canada to require all students to take a course dealing with Aboriginal health issues, including residential schools, UNDRIP, treaties, Aboriginal rights, and Indigenous teachings and practices. I'll flag that, again, everything's sort of conflated under this banner of Aboriginal health issues. So I invite you to use that analysis as you go forward and see distinctly what's copper pot work, what's basket work. And so this work was actually taken on by 2 Indigenous medical students in their second year. They took it on as part of their research curriculum, and they took it on because of their own personal lived experiences of having a lack of cultural safety at their institution. And in talking to colleagues from across the country, they noticed a pattern and a theme, and so they developed this project. They send a survey out to Indigenous medical students to inquire about how schools are progressing in terms of meeting these foundational obligations. As you can see, the scores are not great. The students have no malintent. They really are approaching this in a spirit of generosity and just wanting to help their schools do better. Unfortunately, these report cards have not been graciously received across the board. In one instance, one of the faculties of medicine threatened legal action against second-year Indigenous medical students if they were to make this report public. In another situation, a faculty of medicine and the senior leaders in that faculty sent a scathing critique of the methodologies and were essentially intimidating these junior Indigenous medical students to undermine and dismiss and invalidate their findings. Are the methodologies perfect? No, certainly not. Is what's contained in these report cards true? I think so. And do these faculties of medicine hold very clear obligations to do better? Absolutely. So I would invite everybody in this room to hold this knowledge that these report cards exist, and to think about your connection to your faculty of medicine and see if perhaps this is an avenue or an area that you can insert yourself and be a part of doing some of this heavy lifting in the copper pots to respond more sufficiently to these specific foundational obligations. I also need to say out loud in words, another thing that happened as a result of these report cards being returned to the faculties of medicine and the deans was that the faculties then turned again to the one or two Indigenous staff that they had to say, make them feel as though they were responsible for these scores, or to kind of see those as a reflection of their work. And so I need to categorically refute that. I know the vast majority of people that work in those roles as either Indigenous coordinators or liaisons or Indigenous faculty. These are incredible humans who work in very difficult situations that are riddled with colonial knots, and they are mitigating these scores. If those individuals were not there, these scores would be much worse, I'm quite confident. And so it really illustrates for us the need to be attentive and mindful to basket work and copper pot work, especially in relation to medical education.
So now we're moving to this second core practice of understand. And this is again about understanding how are these operating in our sphere of influence and what instructions have we been given by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people to respond. And so there was a research component of our project. One of our first steps was to understand our staff and leadership engagement with the foundational obligations in our office. And so we launched this survey to ask people to rank, reflect, and strategize on their engagement with each of these foundational obligations. And we continue to do this survey every 6 months, and we're now on round 3. It's happening right now, and it's a very, very minimal tool, but it's been incredibly helpful to help us guide our actions. So the first time we did it, this represents the rank component of the first round from June 2022, and each circle is one of those foundational commitments. The federal ones are on the top and the provincial ones are on the bottom, and the darker the color, the more engagement with the foundational commitments. And as you can see, there was a tremendous amount of variability across our office. So this was really alarming to me that in a province where we had the in plain sight report, we'd had the TRC for several months or several years, that there were still people who hadn't even read it. That said, it gave us really, really clear sense of where we needed to go next. And so we designed a mandatory foundational obligation series for everyone in our office to help us all get on the same page and understand the instructions that we've been given. And it's now part of our onboarding process as well. In terms of the qualitative data, we arrived at this handful of pragmatic findings that help daylight what is required to stop white supremacy and Indigenous-specific racism. And so on the POM, and we've done it here today, is we found that starting conversations with the grounding principles and the inherent rights are critical to changing the way that we do our work. And then the first two fingers talked about the status quo in our office, that there are mountains of colonial knots in our work. They're in every nook and cranny. And there was variable knowledge among our colleagues about the instructions that we've been given to untie those. And then the three final fingers, I really think of them as telling us what we need to get where we are going. And the first one, which just by coincidence was the middle finger, is the power of enabling leadership. So Bonnie's willingness to use the difficult terms of white supremacy and racism. She gave permission to everyone in our office to pick up this work during work time and put down something else that they were busy with to prioritize this work. We have not had a lunch and learn the whole 2 years of this project. And also in Bonnie's enabling leadership, knowing that she will stand with us when a colonial knot is identified, and maybe it's with partners, or and Bonnie will stand with us and help us untie that knot. The other really important thing that we have found we need to do this work is operational support. So this work is complex, it's relational, and it doesn't get done when people need to do it off the side of their desks. Having team members, a combination of settlers and Indigenous people working together who can support it across the office is really valuable. And Danièle has talked about it a little. When you have one Indigenous person dangling off the edge of your org chart, or one Indigenous health team dangling off the edge of the org chart, we're talking about bringing that group into the heart of the work, every part of the work of an office. So we also heard, and this is the area that we're working on right now with our colleagues, that they wanted clear guidance, specific direction, and practical tools. And I'm going to pass it back to Danièle to do a very short turbo version of the tools that we've been using.
Yes, so this is where you can prepare for whiplash, because we're going to go through like 15 slides in less than 2 minutes. So our practical tools fall into these 5 different buckets, and we want to share them with you so you can ask about them in the Q&A if there's an area that you're particularly interested in. So we're doing unlearning, monitoring, undoing, hardwiring, and demonstrating trustworthiness and accountability. And this is a bucket that's really emerging and is going to be a key focus as we continue this work. So I'm going to read out the first bullet of our Indigenous Rights, Truth and Reconciliation vision, which reads, "We affirm the inherent rights and title of BC First Nations, whose territory stretches to every inch of the province. We acknowledge that these rights can only be fully exercised when the ecosystems in which they are embedded are vibrant, biodiverse, and loved and cared for. Therefore, we share a collective responsibility to the health and wellness of these territories. We are the land as Indigenous peoples. We can never be fully healthy and well if we don't have a good relationship and if the health and wellness of our lands and waters is in jeopardy. So we wanted to name that explicitly, and that's why that's there. Kate just mentioned we have a foundational obligation series that was an essential training for the whole office. We have identified 24 foundational obligations that we feel are most relevant to our work at the OPHO, and that we've decided as a team we're going to collectively make efforts to advance, challenge, and elevate through reconciliation. And so they fall into themes of data, land and water, thinking intersectionally, Indigenous health, wisdom, and governance, unlearning, and recruitment and retention. We have this incredible Unlearning Club that went on for 17 months. Please ask Kate about it in the Q&A. She developed an incredible curriculum that mapped to Kamara Jones's 3 tasks of naming racism, asking how it's operating here, and organizing and strategizing to act. So we met every month for 2 hours, and we would do homework before we arrived, and we would do extended territorial acknowledgements, territorial and rights acknowledgements, that really helped us understand where we live and the colonial harms in the places that we live. We have policy review tools. We have a foundational obligations cheat sheet, which is an Excel sheet that has all of those hundreds of specific directions in it that we can quickly access at our desks. I will pause to say that at the OPHO, we have demonstrated excellence in keeping Indigenous people out of the office. And we succeeded in upholding white supremacy for over a decade. We did so good, you guys. A+++. So in 2012, Bonnie mentioned my predecessor, Evan Adams, was hired into this position. I took over from him in 2015. Since that time, 2015, 2019, we had specific recommendations in TRC and Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls that we should recruit more Indigenous people to work in our office. That didn't happen. In November 2020, we had the BC In Plain Sight report, which looks at anti-Indigenous racism in BC's healthcare system. Recommendation 14 again said you need to recruit more Indigenous people to work in your office. Bonnie and I got together and we said, yeah, we've got to do something about this. We named 3 actions we were going to take to try and recruit more people. And then Kate came and joined us, and I said, I don't think we've hired anybody Indigenous. Can you look into that? And so she very helpfully did an audit for us and confirmed that we had not hired any other Indigenous people, and then set to work to figure out what were the colonial knots. Why hadn't these actions resulted in any hires? Turns out that we weren't implementing the actions very frequently or consistently, and there were other deeper knots attached that disincentivized, for example, enacting an Indigenous preference statement. So everything we'd been doing was in this highly performative end of the spectrum. And thanks to Kate and the program, and thank you to Bonnie and her courageous enabling leadership, we now were able to untie some of those colonial knots, and we're up to 3 additional Indigenous full-time permanent staff in the office, and then myself, and then we have multiple master's students and Indigenous youth interns. So we've had a dramatic improvement. We've got to reconcile. Yeah, you can clap, it's exciting. We're very excited. So we must be conscious, coherent, consistent if we want to effect true reconciliation. Again, words from Jody Wilson-Raybould. And so we think about it a little bit as though you're going to the gym. And maybe you haven't been to the gym in a long time. Maybe you've never been to the gym. So those first few visits are a little tentative. You probably need a trainer or a coach. You might have a workout program, and you have to stick really to that routine until you learn it and it becomes a bit more comfortable for you. Those first few days at the gym suck. It's hard. You don't know what you're doing. It feels awkward and uncomfortable. And then you wake up the next day and you're so stiff and sore and you have to go and do it again. So the thing about this metaphor is that the discipline in those earliest days are what is so critical, because it's the discipline of doing this work when you don't want to do it, when it's awkward, when it's heavy, when it's painful, because that is what ultimately is going to build up the stamina and build up the muscles to be able to do this work. So I'm going to pass it over to Bonnie in just a moment to describe the little exercise that we'll ask you guys to do. But first, I want to share this beautiful piece of artwork from Dene artist and bioethicist Dr. Lisa Boivin. This is called Sharing Bioethics. It was published in the CMAJ in September of 2018. And this is another anchor image for our work. We think about this often because this is the work. It's relational. It's about being in good relationships. It's about resetting those relationships. And really what we've been talking about this morning is all of the work that we've been doing in this circle, in our biomedical circle, to be able to show up at this ethical space of engagement in a good, trustworthy way. So please hold that and use this image to inspire you and bring hope to your work as Bonnie describes to you what the exercise will be. Masicho.